Hey everybody, happy Friday. Okay, I'm too excited. I gotta calm down. In case you're wondering, I haven't had coffee yet, so here we are, let's do it. It's Friday. Morning everybody, happy Friday, and I'm excited to welcome you to a new series on this channel. Now, my longtime viewers will know that I love documenting my various language learning journeys. I've documented learning a language from scratch. I've done reading my very first novel. I've done maintaining a whole bunch of different languages over time and improving those skills. I've also been documenting myself learning Mandarin Chinese from scratch for the last year and a half. And in this series that we're gonna discuss today, I will be reviving my German language skills, but also taking them to new levels where they've never been, and finally just taking my German to those really advanced levels, which I've always wanted to reach. Can't wait to talk about it. Okay, so in this video, we're gonna talk a little bit about some background on my German and what my plans are with this series, but we're also gonna talk about my personal principles for how to get back to a rusty language and revive those skills, because I do have a process. I've done this a number of times. Actually, on this channel, I once did, as part of my Polyglot Journey series, I sort of got back to my German and Portuguese at the same time. And if you want to go watch those videos, they're not as high quality as my current videos, but you can actually see me go from really rusty in German and Portuguese and to, I think, actually somewhat fluent again, pretty fluent, and it was a really cool thing. But this time I want it to be different. I want to really focus language by language, and I want to, like I said, really finally take my German skills to being definitely advanced. That's where I want to be, because for me, German falls into the category of languages that I speak. For those of you who are new here, I speak 7 foreign languages, and then 8 if you include Mandarin Chinese, but I don't really claim to speak Mandarin just yet. So let's just say 7 foreign languages that I have spoken fluently at one point. Now, some of those today are a bit rusty due to the last 4 years of writing a book and building Journaly, which is really coming along well, by the way. And so I have languages that I've spoken to really high levels, such as Japanese and French. Now, Spanish is a little bit below that, but those are languages that I've definitely spoken to pretty advanced levels, and so they have gone beyond what I like to call the language learning barrier, which is this thing I made a whole video about once, where it's almost like after you reach a certain point in a language, you cross this barrier to where the language becomes a lot more stable and it starts to atrophy a lot more slowly. But up until that point, for me at least, it feels like if I don't quite get over that barrier, then my language skills, they just decline so much more quickly, and it can be very frustrating, especially if you're trying to maintain a language over time. It's a lot easier to properly maintain your language skills if you get them past that learning barrier that I like to talk about. And so for me, Japanese, French, and I would say Spanish, and to a degree Italian, I've gotten those over the barrier before, and so those skills, they atrophy a lot more slowly. But Portuguese, even though it's very similar to Spanish and Italian and French, it drops so much more quickly because I never got it quite to that really advanced level, and it's the same thing with German and also Swedish. And so, like I mentioned, in this series, my goal is not only to revive my German skills from being pretty rusty as they are right now, back to their highest ever point, but I also want to just finally just push them into being really advanced so that once and for all, I can maintain that language to a much higher level and much more efficiently and successfully. So now let's talk about my personal set of very basic principles for getting back to a rusty language and reviving those skills. Principle number 1 is going back to something that is delightfully familiar. Now, delightfully is of course optional, but the reason why I put that in my principle is that ideally, this should be something that really gives you this sort of wonderfully positive nostalgia, right? Something that you have fond memories of. It could be a resource, a textbook, it doesn't matter. Something that you just really enjoyed studying when you think back to those memories of learning that language. Because for me, learning a language is a deeply emotional, long-term process. It's a journey, and so now I'm trying to essentially re-establish the habit of learning that language, and one of the ways to help that succeed is by making sure we have a lot of positive feelings and emotions surrounding it. Now, the more practical side of this first principle is the familiar aspect. Now, the reason why I like to go back to familiar materials or familiar content, whatever it might be, is that in theory, that's all knowledge that I already once had. It's still in here somewhere. It's just, rusty or dormant, or maybe I forgot it. But the point is that these are all things that I once knew. And so in my own experience, and I've done this quite a lot of times, it's so much more efficient going back to those things that I once already knew, and you just sort of feel everything flooding back to you, and you'll often find things by association. So learning one thing over again, you'll start to remember stuff like all over the place. And I just feel like it's such an effective technique to go back to things that you've already studied that are very familiar to you, and it just starts to just fire all these neurons and memories, and it's a really cool experience. Now, my second principle is coming back to something that is easy for you to do. As I mentioned a second ago, a huge part of this is we're essentially trying to reinstate a habit of learning this language. Now, in a recent video, which I'll link up above and in the description, I talked about how habit formation research has shown that the most important thing when establishing a new habit, it's not how long do you do something on a given session. What is way more important are repetitions of an activity in a given period, but also the frequency at which you do those repetitions. And so it's far more effective to study a language for 15 or 30 minutes per day rather than 5 hours once per week. Now, for me especially, right now, I am incredibly busy. I have so much going on. A lot of you will know a lot of those projects, and it's just, I need to make sure that this is easy for me to stick to, and so I can successfully do it every single day for several months, and that will really help me to reestablish that habit. It's always easy to turn it up. You can always add new things in, but I think lots of people, when they come back to a foreign language, they remember what it used to be like. They remember when they used to study for hours per day and they had this really elaborate routine. And so sometimes the instinct can be to jump right back in at that point. But again, personally, I think it's really important to start more slowly and pick an activity that, like I said, principle one, it's familiar and delightful, but also easy for you to do so that you're most likely to succeed doing it every day. Now, principle number 3, and again, these are just my principles, so this third one in particular, it might not work for everybody, but I like to go back to the basics. I've spoken a lot on this channel about how unbelievably effective it is to sort of study the basics of a language over and over again at different times in your journey. A great example of this for me is with the French language. Now, I once worked as a French customer service agent. I did all these different things, worked as a professional in the French language. My French was pretty darn advanced. And at that point, I went back and I got this huge beginner textbook. I was actually living in Germany at the time. And I just started going back through the basics. And I remember there were so many things where I was like, oh, now that makes sense, right? Like things that back when I was a beginner, they just didn't click for me. But because now I had so much context around that language, everything just made sense. And so I like to go back to the basics anyway. So reviving these sort of rusty language skills, for me personally, it's the perfect opportunity to go right back to basics, even if I know that I probably don't really need to do that. And in principle number 1, I mentioned that emotional aspect. Well, it's the same here in principle 3. There really is, for me, just this wonderfully positive, delightful nostalgia, and it's almost like getting that chance to be a beginner again and to just feel those same feelings. The memories come back. For me in German, like I have these wonderful memories of being a beginner in German. So yeah, going back to basics, it helps me sort of relive those moments, and it helps me to not really be in a hurry. I learn languages because I love them. I learn them for pleasure, and again, it's a lifelong journey. I'm not necessarily desperate to revive my German tomorrow. So for me, the first step is always to go to my language learning activity tracking sheets. Now, a lot of you will know that I love my activity tracking sheets, and so do many of you. It's probably one of my most popular things I've ever designed. It was in my book that I wrote, How to Maintain Languages. But I also have a Google Drive, which I've shared with hundreds of you now who've downloaded it. I'll leave a link for that in the description as well. But one of the many benefits of my language learning activity tracking sheets is that they serve as this sort of chronological, historical record of everything that I once did in any given language, which also tells me everything that I once knew. So now that we're trying to revive knowledge that I once had, well, the language tracking sheet is a perfect way to go back and see what are all the things that I did before? So finally then, what am I gonna do with my German first? Well, I have decided to start with Babbel. So many of you will know that Babbel is one of my favorite language learning applications. I really do love it, and I think that their content is excellent whenever I'm starting a new language, and it really does take me quite a long way. Now, I've actually gone through the entire German core content catalog on Babbel probably twice, I think even a third time partially, but so that is very familiar content to me. It's delightful. I have the most wonderful memories when I was living in Lisbon, Portugal, sitting in cafes absolutely everywhere, just like studying my Babbel lessons and preparing to move to Hamburg, Germany, where I did eventually live. It's very easy for me to do because all the content is very well organized, and it's just all I have to do is show up, log into the app, and just do at least one lesson. And of course, if I can do more, I'll do more, but it's very easy for me to make sure that I do Babbel every single day. And finally, it does satisfy this really nice sort of principle I have of going back to the basics and sort of revisiting all those things. And so, you know, there we go. Babbel for me is the perfect resource to start back with. So I'm planning on doing Babbel every single day. Like I said, my goal will just be to do one lesson, but I have a prediction that I'll probably end up doing 2 or 3 lessons per day. That's often how this works. But the most important thing for me when building a new habit is make sure that my absolute commitment is something very, very attainable. So 1 lesson on Babbel, very doable for me every day. In the next video, I will speak in German. That will give us a really nice baseline and a sort of comparison point when we get to the end of this series. Now, I've often talked about how it's really nice to give yourself actionable goals, and also that it's nice to sort of build up this stockpile of content and resources that you sort of can't wait to get to. And so I actually have this novel that I got in German years ago, and it's called Ein ganzes Leben by Robert Seethaler. And this is something that I got back when I was really, really diving into German deeply. And I remember just thinking, this is the novel that I want to be my first in German. And so I feel like this is a very nice actionable goal for the end of this series, which is that maybe I'll transition to a new series where I'll document myself reading my very first novel in German. So that's kind of the end goal here. I think that, of course, I want to just be able to speak really well, interact with people, and we can do all kinds of fun German language challenges if you want on the channel, where you can test my skills in a very candid way. But for me personally, one of my end goals, I think, is to be able to finally read my very first novel in German. Okay, everybody, I hope you're as excited as I am. I think this is going to be a really, really nice series. So please do join me. I'll see you back here on Monday for the next video of the channel, but I'll also be excited to see you back for the second episode of Reviving My German. Happy Friday, have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you next week.